Hi everyone and welcome. In this lesson we're going to learn about the basics of slope, one of the more important concepts when you're dealing with lines or linear equations, and something that you'll definitely need to understand if you're taking algebra right now. So before we even start talking about numbers and equations and formulas, let's take a look at an example from everyday life. So I want you to take a look at the pictures on the screen here. We have hill A and hill B. Which hill do you think would be harder to climb and why? Well, I think most of us would agree that hill B would be harder to climb. But why? Well, if we just look at the photos here, hill B looks a lot steeper than hill A. And that's actually exactly what slope measures. Slope measures how steep something is. So we could describe the hills in this way. Hill A has a shallow slope, and hill B has a steep slope. But of course in math, we don't deal with hills, we deal with lines and graphs of lines. But the idea is exactly the same. Later in this lesson, we're going to learn how to calculate slope. And sometimes when we start adding formulas and numbers, things feel a little bit more complicated than they actually are. So I want you to always go back to this definition. Slope measures the steepness of a line. And you'll notice that I've put the letter M in brackets after slope. In math, the letter M is used to represent slope. That's all. So let's talk about the 4 different types of slope. So our first slope, and this is the one that you're going to see probably the most often when you're learning slope, is something called a positive slope. So how do we know it's positive? Well, if we start at the left side of our graph and we move right, so if you follow my cursor, the line goes up or it increases. So in these cases, you'll have a positive slope. And we could write it this way. The slope, or M, is greater than 0. Okay, so the second slope is a negative slope, and it's exactly what you're thinking. It's the opposite of a positive slope. So if, again, we start on the left side of our graph and we move right, the line is going down or it's decreasing. So we would say that this is a negative slope, or M is less than 0. Okay, so the third slope that we're going to deal with is something called a 0 slope. Again, if we move across our graph left to right, you'll actually realize that the line isn't going up or down at all. It's not increasing or decreasing. It's a horizontal line. So anytime that you see a horizontal line in math, it has a slope of 0. Okay, and the final type of slope that we're going to deal with is something called an undefined slope. And this is when you're dealing with vertical lines. So if we go left to right, you'll actually realize that we can't move along the line horizontally because the line is just going up and down. So later in math, you'll understand exactly why this is the case, but for now, it's really just enough to recognize that every vertical line has an undefined slope. Okay, so now that we've learned how to identify the type of slope, let's learn how to measure it. And of course, when we were talking about hills, we could simply say hill B is steeper than hill A by looking at the photos. However, in math, we can't do this, and what do we need? As always, we need an equation, or we need a formula. So this is a really important one. If you don't already have this memorized, write it down, highlight it, put it somewhere that you can see when you're doing your homework questions. Very important. So slope, or m, is equal to rise over run. So what is rise? Well, it's how much the line goes up or down. What's run? It's how much the line goes right or left. So let's work through an example together. If you see at the bottom left of the screen, we have a line here. And before we even start calculating the slope, let's see if you can identify the type of slope here. Remember, we have a positive slope, a negative slope, a zero slope, or an undefined slope. If you said that this is a positive slope, then you're correct. Again, if we move left to right, this line is increasing. So the slope will have to be greater than 0. Okay, so let's go step by step of how to solve and how to find slope. So step 1, you need to identify points on the graph. You need at least 2. You'll see on the graph I've identified 5 points. Okay, now we need to choose any 2 of these points. For the purpose of this example, let's use the yellow and the red points. So if you look at my cursor, I'm just circling around those points at the bottom of the line. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is calculate the rise. So remember, rise is how much the line goes up or down. And you'll notice on the side I've put up positive and down negative. So if we look at our graph here, if you start at the bottom and you work your way up the y-axis, you'll notice that the numbers get positive. So this is why I've put up positive. And if we go down, you'll notice that the numbers are getting negative. So that's actually common sense just from looking at the graph, but I've put it there as a reminder since we're just learning now how to calculate slope. So if we start from the yellow point and we move up to the red point, you'll notice that we've moved up 2, so positive 2. Okay, now we need to calculate the run. And again, if we move across the x-axis, if you move right, you'll notice that the numbers are getting positive, and if you move left, the numbers are getting negative. So in this case, we're moving right 1, so positive 1. And you can actually continue doing this all the way up the line. So if you go from the red point to the green, up 2, right 1, from the green to the orange point, and the orange to the purple point. So let's give our final slope here. So our slope would be rise over run, 2 over 1. You could simply just say the slope is 2, and you'd be absolutely correct. In this case, I've actually chosen to leave the 1 there because it's easier to visualize the rise and the run if you leave your answer as a fraction. So again, you could just say slope is 2 here, absolutely fine. Okay, so an interesting question. Did we have to choose the points that I chose? So if you remember, I chose points that were close together. So we did yellow and red, red and green, green and orange and purple. But what would happen to the slope if we chose 2 points that were further apart? Well, let's find out. So what if I chose the yellow point and the green point? So again, we have a rise of positive 4 and we have a run of positive 2. So in this case, our slope would be 4 over 2. But just like any other fraction in math, we can actually simplify this and put it into lowest terms. So 4 over 2 is also equal to 2 over 1. So even though the points were further away, we actually got the same slope. Okay, well, another thing to consider. In these first two examples, we've actually chosen points at the bottom of the line and worked our way up. What would happen to the slope if we started from the top point, so that purple point, and worked our way down? Let's try it out. So you'll notice that if we go from the purple point to the orange point, we're going down 2, so -2, and left 1, so -1. And again, you can do this all the way down the line. So our slope in this case would be -2 over -1. And if you remember from pre-algebra, a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So once again, our slope is 2 over 1. So what do these three examples tell us? Well, they tell us something very important about slope. Slope is constant. So this means that the steepness of a straight line is the same at any point. In simple terms, you can choose any 2 points that you want on the line to calculate your slope. So you could choose 2 points close together. You could choose 2 points further away. You could start from the top of the line and work your way down, or you could start from the bottom and work your way up. This is a really useful concept to understand because as a student, it means that there are no wrong points. You don't have to look for specific points. So do yourself a favor and choose the 2 easiest points that you can find on a line and calculate the slope using those. Okay, so now that we've covered the basics of slope, let's see if you can do an example on your own. If you need more time, feel free to pause the video here and then start it again to check your answer. Okay, so before we do any calculations, let's determine what type of slope this is. So take a moment, look at the line, and figure out whether this is a positive, a negative, a zero slope, or an undefined slope. If you said it was a negative slope, then you're correct. So just as a reminder, I've put up there that our answer needs to be negative, or our slope needs to be less than 0. Okay, so let's identify some points on the graph. I've picked 3 here. You can pick whatever points you want. You may have chosen to use the purple and the yellow points, or maybe you used the yellow and the red, or maybe you even decided to choose the purple point and the red point. No matter which pair of points you used, you should have gotten a slope of -3 over 2. So I've drawn the rise and the run lines here for you so that you can see how we got -3 over 2. So in math, it's always a good idea, if you can, to check that your answer actually makes sense. So I'm going to give you 2 things that you can do when you're practicing slope. The first is to identify the type of slope, which, if you recall, I've asked you this question first in both of the examples before we even started calculations. So it sounds very simple, but it's a good way to check. So again, this is a negative slope, so it must be negative. Did we get a negative answer? Yeah, we did. -3 over 2. The second thing that you can do is do more than one slope calculation. So again, because it's a new concept, the best way to get familiar with it is to practice. So maybe you would calculate the slope from the purple point to the yellow point, and then calculate the slope from the yellow point to the red point. Later in math, you might get comfortable enough just to do one calculation, but again, when you're learning, it's always a good way to check that you have the right answer. Okay, so before we finish, let's quickly review the important things that we learned today. First, slope measures the steepness of a line. Second, slope is constant. So choose any 2 points that you want on the line when you're calculating slope. And finally, slope is calculated by using the formula rise over run.